Our gospel lesson is found in the Gospel of Matthew, beginning in chapter 9 with verse 35. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out the demons. May God bless the reading and hearing of this word. May we hear in it a word that is to us and that is for us on this day. The Bible Belt. I think we probably all have some pretty good images which come to mind when we hear that term. Now, I did not Google the term to find out how Google defines it, but here's what comes to mind for me. Well, the Bible Belt is in the South. Now, maybe it presses out to the eastern part of the Midwest, but the Bible Belt, by and large, is a southern thing. But the most important geographical piece that we need to warm up to is that we are very much in the Bible Belt. Now, here's some things we're going to find in the Bible Belt. We're going to find a lot of churches. I've noted in some small town that there are so many churches and they are so close together that some of them share a parking lot. Some of their parking lots are so close to one another that you could throw a rock from one parking lot to the other. And given the acrimonious nature of our relationships with churches, but sometimes they may well have thrown some rocks from one parking lot to the other. In those churches and churchyards, there are going to be church signs. And while I didn't Google the Bible Belt, I did Google church signs in preparation for this sermon. And here are a few that got my attention. Whoever stole our AC units, keep one. It's going to be hot where you're going. It's a little mean, but I mean, the fact that there is a highway to hell but only a stairway to heaven says a lot about anticipated traffic numbers. Ouch again. Let's go a different direction. Some signs from closer to our own theological camp, and we'll devote this one as we continue to celebrate Pride Month, but couple that with Father's Day. This is a good one for just that. Jesus had 2 dads, and he turned out just fine. And here is one good enough that we will just stop on this one. If you're more fortunate than others, build a longer table instead of a higher fence. But since there are more churches and more church signs in the Bible Belt, there are also more people who claim that their daily lives, their daily decisions, their political views, the way they spend their money, etc., are influenced by their faith, by the Bible. Moreover, in the Bible Belt, there are more people who would, in comparison to other parts of the country, would describe themselves as followers of Jesus. Now let's just stop there and say, we have some problems to talk about in the Bible Belt as it relates to these claims. It was an article by a retired pastor named Scott Poole who inspired this sermon, and a portion of that article was included in our contemporary reading today. Let me interject here one more quote which gets to the integrity issues that we struggle with here in the Bible Belt as it relates to our claims to be followers of Jesus. "The buckle on the Bible Belt is broken," he wrote, "in a stunning contradiction of the spirit of the Jesus in all four Gospels. Whoever can propose the most hurtful policies concerning LGBTQ persons, strike the most friendly poses with an assault weapon, and take the most unwelcoming policy toward immigrants can most effectively court the support of the evangelical Christian base. It's enough to make one wonder if Christianity can survive Christianity." Let's shift to our text, because it gives us a tiny snapshot of the first people who laid hold of that claim to be followers of Jesus. The passage, I would say, in comparison to some others, is pretty straightforward. It begins with a description of the things that Jesus did as he moved about the region. We can review the list, and I'm pretty certain that none of it is going to surprise any of us. I'll read straight from the text. He went about proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. There's nothing surprising there, is there? There's nothing unsettling there. There's nothing to knock us off our feet. Jesus is just going about and described in the Gospels doing Jesus-type things. He's doing the things that we would expect Jesus to do. Then the famous statement, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few." That statement serves as a bridge between two thoughts. The first thought being this description of what Jesus was doing. The second thought being regarding the disciples and what Jesus was calling, commissioning, and empowering them to do. And here's the rub, you might say. And this is the one thing we need to glean from this text if we don't glean anything else from it. They were called, almost word for word, to do the same things that Jesus was doing. I mean, we aren't surprised when Jesus feels and acts upon compassion for the marginalized, the ostracized, the stigmatized, the dehumanized, and the powerless. But it's a little bit staggering when we come to grips with the fact that we have been called to do the same thing. None of us would bat an eye at the notion that Jesus was an agent of healing, announcing the good news of God's love in every place where he traveled. But we ought to be stopped in our tracks to know and to hear the announcement that those who identify as followers of Jesus are called, commissioned, and empowered to do the very same things. On a Sunday when, with Ryan's help, we have turned our attention to the Juneteenth celebration, and indeed it is a thing to be celebrated, but we can't help but also be reminded by the ways and the means that the status quo will delay and deny justice. And when we consider just who Jesus was and who he stood for, we don't have to stretch our minds very much to imagine where Jesus would stand regarding the pursuit of racial justice in the here and now. In some corners of the Christian church, Jesus is treated like a nice guy who walked about telling everybody about God's love and letting the children sit on his knee. And we wonder, why in the world would people want to kill somebody that's as nice a fellow as that? He was killed because Jesus spent his life and ministry picking those people up who had been crushed under the oppressive weight of political powers that be and religious powers that be. And that frightened and perplexed and threatened those who held that power. And so they killed Jesus so those oppressed people wouldn't get cozy with the notion that they were supposed to be free. Now, going back to Chuck Poole's article, one more quote from there. The Jesus who is reported to have said that all of the holy words and all the holy books could be summed up in a single simple sentence, treat others as you wish to be treated, would call those who claim his name to denounce public policies poisoned by Christian nationalism, white supremacy, homophobia, and embrace instead a life of kindness, understanding, welcome, and love. Today's passage, as we think about some of the pressing issues of our day, today's gospel passage clearly paints a picture of Jesus who was a healer. In fact, the text says he was a healer of every sickness and disease. Can you imagine a Jesus who was committed to such task, to do anything but denounce health care policies which provide adequate health care for only a few while denying it to the poor, who suffer in manners they need not suffer, and who die deaths they need not die? How is it possible to conjure up a Jesus who would do anything but to tear down that system? The Jesus of the Gospels is one who wouldn't let his own followers even draw their swords to defend him when the Roman soldiers came to take him away. What might we imagine he would say to the seemingly unrestrained availability of assault weapons on our streets? And the flippant response of both lawmakers and Bible Belt Christians who, when push comes to shove, lend more weight to their interpretation of the Second Amendment than to the teachings of Jesus. Now, just in case there is any angst about just how mixed up and kneaded together the preacher is going to get religion and politics on this day, I believe it was New Testament scholar and theologian Karl Barth who said that a preacher should stand with the Bible in one hand and the New York Times in the other. Well, that's all I've got. I don't have the New York Times, and I'm going to tell you something. I don't know if he's right or not, but what I would have asked us to turn our attention to is as faith-based and as religious a question as there is. And that is the imitation of Jesus. Not as in a manner that would make us sanctimonious. Not in a manner that would lay a burden or standard upon us that we could never really keep. But simply in a way of attempting to model the way of compassion and love that was first modeled by Jesus as best we can, with God's help, one day at a time, one encounter at a time. Perhaps sometimes it is complex to discern where Jesus would stand on the pressing social issues of the day, but sometimes it's as plain as day. Not because Jesus would belong to any political party or the other, but because if Jesus was walking through the Bible Belt today, he would be the same Jesus today that he was then. There is a wonderful Hasidic story that I tell on occasion. The story goes that the rabbi, on the night before the Sabbath, would go out into the woods and would disappear. And when he came back, he was inspired as he led them in worship on the next day. They wondered where he was going to get all of this inspiration. So they sent out a scout to spy on him, to find out what he was up to out there. And the scout found him going into the old cabin of a crippled woman who lived there. He saw the rabbi take in her firewood. Through the window, he saw the rabbi prepare her a meal and then to wash gently her brittle and crippled feet. The scout was taken aback. He could barely speak. But when he arrived in the town, the people were waiting for him. Where did the rabbi go? Where did the rabbi go? Did he go all the way up to heaven? And the man, still barely able to speak, could only say, no, he went much higher than that. Sometimes the question may sound like that. How high are we willing to go in the service of Christ? Or we may put it another way. Not so much, as the article said, what would Jesus do? Because, let's face it, most of the time we know. So that isn't the question. The question is instead, what will we do as followers of Jesus Christ in the Bible Belt? Amen.